As secondary armament, the tank featured two Hotchkiss Model 1914 8mm machine guns, each in a ball mount, one to the right of the turret, the other on the hull's lower plate. The standard issue machine gun of the French Army from 1916 onward, progressively replacing the older, more vulnerable to mud Saint-Étienne Model 1907, the Hotchkiss machine gun fired 8x50mm rimmed Lebel ammunition from either 24 or 30 rounds rigid strips or 249 round metal belts. It had a rate of fire of 400 to 500 rounds per minute on average and was appreciated for its high reliability and air cooling, which made it reliable even in the mud of the trenches. There were also 5 openable firing ports from which the crew could fire either the CSRG Chauchat Model 1915 machine rifle or the sidearms. The turret had a weight of 4,600 kilograms, which included 1,300 kilograms of armor. The armor layout was similar to the hull, except the 35mm thickness was apparently all around the turret. The complete vehicle had a weight of 41,400 kilograms, reaching a height of 3 meters with the observation cupola and 2.78 meters without it. Trials of the FCM-1A began at FCM's facilities at La-Seyne-Sur-Mer on the 20th of December 1917 in front of a large delegation. FCM had, by that point, made it clear that the FCM-1A prototype was mostly experimental and was not intended for military adoption as it was presented. The obstacle course which had been prepared for the FCM-1A included 3.5 meter wide trenches, 0.9 meter high walls, and artillery shell craters 6 meters in diameter and 4 meters in depth. The FCM-1A was easily able to overcome them. The vehicle was tested on some considerable slopes and was able to climb up to a 65% slope. It also tried going through a forest of pines, going over a 35 centimeter wide tree and shattering a 28 centimeter one. The tank could reach a maximum speed of 10 km per hour and cruised at 6 km per hour on good terrain, well within the standards of World War I tanks. This first series of trials concerned mobility only, and there were not yet any firing trials of the gun. They have, however, been quite extensively documented, with an 80 minutes film being available on the internet. The FCM-1A left a major impression on the delegation. The vehicle offered some very impressive cross-country capacities, far superior to the very mediocre ones featured on the previous Saint-Chamond and CA1. Its massive size was thought to potentially have a major morale effect on enemy forces if it was to enter service. The vehicle also featured many innovative design choices. The FCM-1A was not without flaws, notably due to the length and narrowness of the vehicle. Turning while stationary was almost impossible, although the track was not at any point at risk of going off. One of the impressive features of the FCM-1A, which may not appear obvious at first glance, was the considerable internal space allocated to the crew. With 7 crew members, the FCM-1A had one of the smallest crews of non-light tanks of World War I. The 23-ton Saint-Chamond, for example, had a crew of 9. The 29-ton Mark V had a crew of 8, and the 30 to 33-ton Sturmpanzerwagen A7V had a crew of 20. At the same time as having relatively few crewmen, the large space inside made the FCM-1A quite impressive in terms of internal habitability, allowing the crew to operate in far better conditions than on most other vehicles of the era. The FCM-1A was also reported to be well designed to counter fires, as a result of having been designed by a naval shipyard, and to have a good number of escape hatches should the crew have to evacuate the tank. There was no bulkhead separating the crew and engine compartments, though no crew member operated near the engine. However, due to the tank's size, no vehicle in possession of the French army of the time could realistically tow it. The solution was provided by attaching tow points and a fair lead on the vehicle, meaning an FCM-1A could be used to tow and recover another one should the need arise. although how effectively it would do so is unknown as just one prototype of the tank was ever built. Soon after the trials began, the FCM-1A's great performances provoked some considerable interest. The new Minister of Armament, Louis Loucheur, wrote to the French Président du Conseil, Georges Clemenceau, requesting an order for 100 vehicles to be placed. The request was for the first 15 to be delivered in July and 80 more to be available by the end of the year. However, no order ended up being placed due mainly to follow-ups of the FCM-1A that FCM had in the meantime proposed. Indeed, around the same time as the FCM-1A began its trials in late 1917, FCM had brought forward 3 new tank designs based on the experience collected by designing and manufacturing the 1A. The lightest was the FCM-A, a 30-ton, 6.92 meters long tank armed with a turret-mounted 75mm howitzer. The middleweight was the FCM-1B, which was the most directly derived from the 1A. The FCM-1B was to be 7.39 meters long, featuring a long-barreled 75mm gun in a turret, be powered by a new 380 horsepower petrol engine, and with a final weight of 45 tons. Lastly, and heaviest of all, was the FCM-2C project. By this time, the FCM-2C was a 9.41 meter long, 62-ton tank project, which immediately got the attention of Estienne to fulfill the role of that very heavy tank he wanted as a complement to the FT. The influential Colonel Estienne remarked on the FCM-1A's success, albeit noting that the trials had been performed on particularly dry ground, and there was a risk of the tank's rear end sinking in the mud due to most of the propulsion elements being located there. Estienne and the French Army's great headquarters ended up opting for the evolved FCM-2C design, which pushed the FCM-1A's size and giantism even further in January 1918. Even being particularly optimistic, this FCM-2C could only enter service in 1919. While it had been decided the French army would adopt the FCM-1A's heavier 75mm armed cousin, the FCM-2C, trials and experimentations nonetheless continued on the prototype as it already had been manufactured. Firing trials of the 105mm gun were performed on the 5th to the 7th of February 1918 with satisfactory results. Later that year, the FCM-1A prototype did receive some considerable modifications, notably to the turret. The 105mm howitzer was swapped out, replaced by a much longer gun. While a number of photos of the FCM-1A armed with this gun exist, it has yet to be identified, and even its caliber is unknown. Both 47 and 75mm have been suggested. In any case, this appears to be a much higher velocity gun than the 105mm, likely not as good in fortification and trench busting, but more accurate at longer ranges and perhaps able to pierce some armor. The vehicle's cupola was also redesigned. From its original square shape, it adopted a rounded one, featuring a stroboscope system. 2 round-shaped plates with holes pierced in them, able to rotate quickly, allowing the commander to see out of the vehicle while offering some protection against machine gun fire. Unlike many French prototypes of the 1910s and 1920s, the eventual fate of the FCM-1A is quite well known. The impressive-looking prototype was, in the 1920s and 1930s, placed outside the Versailles Tank School as a flower pot. It slowly degraded in this state, while often being used as a photo background for studying officers due to its impressive looks. The FCM-1A prototype was still at Versailles when France fell to German armies in 1940. Long out of use and completely incapable of even running, the old prototype most likely met an unceremonious end at a scrapyard. The last known photo of it dates from 1940 and shows a German soldier standing on the aged beast. Out of all the vehicles which reached prototype stage in World War I France, the FCM-1A was without a doubt one of the most advanced and powerful. For a vehicle designed in 1916 and which had its prototype manufactured in 1917, FCM's heavy tank indeed presents a variety of modern features: a rotating turret, sensible crew accommodations, and a very powerful main armament in the context of trench warfare, protected under one of the thickest armors of the era. Despite these very modern features, the FCM-1A was hindered both by the massive delays caused by the Renault in 1917, as well as STN's opinion that a heavy tank design ought to be heavier. This contributed to the vehicle not being adopted, though this was not without some form of regret. In October of 1918, in a letter to Clemenceau, the Minister of Armament once again reminded that the FCM-1A had a crucial advantage over the 2C. It had been built, and while the 2C was vastly on paper at that point, the 1A could quite realistically have entered service. Indeed, had it been adopted, it would not have been entirely unthinkable to see the 1A used in combat during the last weeks of World War I. Nonetheless, even if this impressive World War I prototype never reached serial production, it remains a fairly important vehicle in the history of French armored development, not only because of its own impressive merits, but also because it launched FCM into armored vehicle design. The shipyard would, in the 1920s and 1930s, become a major producer of such vehicles, with the FCM-2C in the 1920s, but also the FCM-36 light infantry tank and participation in the B-1 program, both with the 1920s FCM char de bataille, and some considerable other experimentations, notably on the B-1 Terre project. FCM would be active all the way up to the post-war years, when it still offered some designs such as the FCM-50T medium tanks, though it could not help being completely superseded by the state-owned AMX. This involvement of FCM in French armored vehicle design goes to show that naval shipyards indeed offered an alternative to artillery manufacturers in the beginning of tank production, with the enclosed armored nature of tanks arguably making them more similar to warships, albeit much smaller, than to simple mobile artillery pieces. That's all for this video. Make sure to follow our website, we'll be releasing new articles on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Reddit, and if you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. Also, likes, comments, and subscriptions on YouTube are greatly appreciated. If you would like to help us continue to develop and expand, also consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.